Welcome to our book chat featuring Kojo Koram, the author of On Commonwealth,
Don't
Britain
forget the
and the
receipts
Aftermath
here
of Empire.
in front. Merel, the seats here.
Welcome to our book chat featuring Kojo Koram, the author of On Commonwealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire. And Dipo, Faloyin, the author of Africa is not a country. And our host, Ruona, Meyer. Please give them a special Ake welcome.
Hello, hello. Deep breath in, out, twist and shout. Welcome to the Ake Arts Book Festival. And this book chat is about two books that have to do with fuckery of a different kind. I'm happy to disappoint you. It's not the type that we've heard about, people talking about romance, blah, blah. We're talking about fuckery, the type that has no lubrication. Colonialism. These books actually are serious. I'm trying to bring a bit of humor to what is a very historical yet existential issue. And I'm talking about the fact that both books, apparently, if there was a recipe, it would be 80% colonialism, 80% empire, 5% memoir, and 15% current affairs as well. Dipo, let's start with you. Dipo. Let's start with you. You know, we had a book chat yesterday and you were to my left. Apologies. When I look at both books, you've managed to sort of use techniques that are somewhat similar, while Dr. Kojo Koram has leaned into his academic side and he has a bibliography, links, he's referenced really tightly. You haven't. So what was it like researching this book and deciding on what type of sourcing you would use?
Well, that's a great question. But firstly, let me just say thank you so much for having me here. This book has taken me to so many wonderful places, but the most important place it has brought me is back home to Lagos. So thank you so much to Ake, to Ms. Lola for all the work that you do. At the heart of this book, I wanted to ensure that it was full of human stories in order to fix the fundamental problem that as a continent we faced in the way in which we're seen around the world. You know, and that problem is that when you ask most people to close their eyes and picture Africa, they think of one of two things, poverty or safari, and nothing else. You know, they imagine that everybody is roaming around with flies roaming around our heads. We're in mud huts, you know, and the only joy we have is the fact that we have elephants and tigers as pets, you know. And the problem with that is that it strips away so much humanity. And what I wanted to do was fill this book with humanity, fill this book with identity, fill it with what I know to be true about this continent and our people, and how passionate we are, how diverse we are, how curious we are about so many different things. And that is something that I wanted to do, so I didn't make it as much of an academic book, but more about something that has a real feeling to it and a real emotion to it. And that was really key in the process to putting it together.
Yeah, we'll talk about the emotional part. There's a part of the book where you even talk about where you were and how a relative was trying to get you to gossip about the death of a dictator, but you totally refused because all of you were scrambling for the channel. We'll get into that. Dr. Kojo, this book has just won the English Pen Prize in less than 48 hours. In fact, he's fresh off the plane. Here. So tell us, why did you really show us that, book? You know, why did you use that technique, and what other types of techniques did you use in sourcing this book? What was your research like?
Brilliant. Thank you, first of all. Also, just to echo Dipo, thank you to Lola, thank you to everyone for bringing me back to Lagos. I came to Ake last year, and I said, I have to come back. Even if it's the middle of term, I'll abandon the students and come back so I can teach, speak to you for this particular book session. And I feel that a lot of the motivation behind On Commonwealth was kind of connected to, but the inverse of what Dipo was saying, that the kind of mishistory around empire produces one image of Africa and Britain, where it's, running around with lions and tigers, and all we can do is just enjoy a dance and be smart because we're happy. So there's an image of Africa, but it also mutates Britain's own image of itself, where Britain doesn't know its own history, doesn't know how it came to be, and doesn't know how deeply indebted it is to this history of empire. So that's what I really wrote On Commonwealth about. I wrote it as a story of Britain through the lens of empire, and showed how so much of what is assumed in Britain as being part of its civilization or democratic elements is actually indebted to the history of hoarding and transferring wealth from different corners of the world. And so this book started off initially as an academic book. But what happened over the course of writing the book was that Britain in 2020 and 2021 suddenly remembered that it used to have the biggest empire the world ever seen. It had forgotten about this for about 50 or 60 years, really. There was a poll that was ran in the UK in the time of the last Commonwealth Games in about 2014, where it found that 1 in 5 British people couldn't name a single Commonwealth nation. I mean, not just talking about Ghana and Nigeria, I'm talking about Jamaica, Australia. They couldn't even name Australia. This is how much histories of empire have been erased from British history. But with the response to the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, there was a pulling down of a statue in a city of Bristol in England called Edward Colston, and this sparked a conversation in the national newspapers and on the British news channels about its own history of empire. And what I felt in terms of engaging with this debate was that it was actually trying to have this discussion in the most frivolous and most kind of what they call the culture wars in Britain lens. And so it started off with debates around statues in the public square. Then it became debates about what books we're allowed to read, what books are on the curriculum. Remember Bola saying before about her inspiration from Jane Austen. At one point, the whole discussion in the UK around decolonization was, should people be allowed or not be allowed to read Jane Austen? This became the entire discussion for a week, as though this was the dream of Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba, to stop people reading Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice. And instead, what they were doing was driving the discussion more and more into these discussions around what TV shows can people watch, is Fawlty Towers imperial, what songs could people sing, and they were trying to, in my opinion, distract the British public from having to face up to the material consequences of empire, the way in which its financial and wealth, its financial instruments and its wealth is tied to the history of empire.
So you wrote a book to make sure we don't forget.
To make sure they don't forget. I feel like people over here remember.
Do they?
A lot?
You know why I say do they? Because you know why I say do they? Because when Dipo and I see some audience members nodding, because when Dipo and I went to a reading earlier, There was a question where somebody said the younger generation does not really care about the history because it doesn't concern them. What part of your book would be relevant to them? And that's why when you say that book was written for Britain to understand, and then we hear someone in Nigeria, a young man in Nigeria, say, why should we care? This is the question I will now ask both of you, starting with you. These books are both about remembrance. What's the one thing we must not forget about empire and colonialism?
There was a fundamental violence to colonialism, both a physical violence as well as an emotional violence. And the emotional side of it is something that we haven't fully comprehended yet. We don't fully appreciate just how much the psychological impact of being colonized, especially in the way that we were colonized, which we'll get to a bit later on when we talk about kind of the structures of how countries were created. But what people need to realize that this is our foundation. These countries did not exist before the Berlin Conference of 1884. These countries are an invention, and they're an entire invention from people who did not have our best interest at heart. And in order for us to reckon with the solutions to the problems that they gave to us, we have to understand what they gave to us in the first place, understand the fabric of it, understand exactly why we are who we are today, why we are called Nigeria, why there are so many languages in this country, why there are so many different identities and religions, what exactly built this. And it's in that misunderstanding that you struggle to find solutions. You know, it's in that misunderstanding that these things continue to perpetrate for decades and decades. And in order for us to stop it, we have to fundamentally understand it. And, you know, I can understand why for a lot of people that history is difficult because we are young countries and these issues are incredibly raw. A lot of the players involved are still alive. Many of them still want to be president, you know? So there is so much still to be reckoned with, but we cannot understand where we're going until we understand the fundamentals of where we've come from.
What's the one thing we should not forget about colonialism or empire?
For me, I think, in addition to what Dipo said, the one thing that we need to remember is just how fundamental this was to the way in which the world came into being. You know, we often talk about empire as though it's this kind of like 100-year mistake that, you know, might have deviated in the 19th century the trajectory of an otherwise developing kind of capitalist entity. But in reality, we're talking about the last 500 years of human history. I have a line in On Commonwealth where I say, we often say that Britain had an empire, and, you know, I might even say that just rolling off the tongue during the course of this discussion, but it's actually more historically accurate to say that the empire had Britain, in terms of when you get the actual unification of Britain, the unification of Scotland and England in 1707, England's already an imperial entity. It has a colonial relationship with Barbados that goes back to the 1620s, a colonial relationship with Jamaica that goes back to the 1670s. It already has slave plantations in Virginia, in what becomes the United States of America. It already has slave forts in what then becomes Sierra Leone and in Ghana. And so when we think about how fundamental Britain, the empire is to our understandings of these places like Britain, like France, like Belgium, I think we need to go beyond the more recent history and look at them as really fundamental to the entire architecture of the modern world.
So let's quickly take a reading quite quickly before I ask you the heavy questions, because I'm trying to give you some respite from the weight of what is never going to go away, because we must not forget. Dipo, could you read the passage that gave you the most stress to write? And then tell us why. And you will be reading the passage that you were warned about, I don't know, maybe by your editor or a relative, and maybe if they warned you, this could get you cancelled. We want to read it, and then you tell us why. So, Dipo, ready when you are.
To achieve this wider goal, the British ran the regions that they did not want to live in using a system of governance known as indirect rule. London would continue to make the big decisions, but on the ground, they would find Africans of questionable morals. Slick to a bribe, decency deficient, and empower them with money and guns and artificial status to subjugate their own people on a day-to-day basis, placing smaller ethnic groups under the dominance of larger ones, creating new societies where they did not previously exist. At times, they completely invented leadership structures and gave out titles and clout to greedy men, individuals who, as Falakuti said, were of low mentality, individuals commonly known as big men. This invented system meant that the colonialists could enjoy their spoils from a cheap distance, not needing to get their hands dirty because they had purchased souls that reveled in wrestling in the corrupt mud. Over time, one large group was forcibly combined with another, and then another, until the British had formed an absurdly large country that was easier to manage under one banner. To keep these disparate groups from working together to overthrow their colonial masters, the British adopted a concurrent policy of divide and rule, where they deliberately created tension between these ethnic groups, favoring one over the other, and placed the big men in their preferred clan into positions of power in government and the military. But independence would still come, a movement that could not be resisted forever. Suddenly, these artificial countries, by British design, were filled with hundreds of demonstrably corrupt big men, whose power and influence over their fellow citizens had been purposely contrived. Rich, unscrupulous, uneducated, well-armed, well-positioned, and often military trained, not satisfied with having their slice of cake, they wanted to eat their country too. And thanks to divide and rule, they had grown to resent the other big men from the other ethnic groups with whom they were now forced to share national resources and fight to be the ultimate big man. But however you slice that national pie, and many tried to cut their own countries into pieces, the reality was that only one of these big men could be president. What this hostile whirlwind of authority created in these countries was not so much one dangerous dictatorship, but rather a series of constant tussles for power in a winner-takes-all royal rumble that stretched across decades, plaguing each of Britain's colonies in West and East Africa, from Ghana and Sierra Leone to Zambia and Kenya. But none had as much of an acute, dangerous reaction to the divide and rule policy as Nigeria, Britain's big, unwieldy, prized possession.
Why was that a hassle to write? Why was that stressful for you? Can you give us some context?
It's stressful because it made me reckon with the reality that Nigeria was a country that was built to fail. Yes. It was built to unravel. We were never meant to last this long. And what was meant to destroy us were these ethnic tensions. Britain created countries that were big and full of as many different languages as possible so that it would be impossible for these ethnic groups to come together and find a common identity, to find a common understanding. It was meant to be essentially impossible. And to put it together, you have to maneuver around all these different threads. You have to maneuver around all the delicacies of that history, of the recency of it, of who was involved and when they were involved. And so dealing with that on an emotional level is difficult enough. Dealing with the detail is incredibly hard as well. And so writing it and putting it together and putting this puzzle into sort of something that resembled the concurrent idea of Nigeria today was a tricky thing to have to do. And what I wanted to do in the book was also ensure that the detail of that was there, but also the emotional weight of it, you know, and that involved calling my parents, talking to them about my parents are here, by the way, if you want to be.
Hello, Mom. Hello, Dad. I want to point to. I want to point to the. Yeah, I want to point to the emotional part you speak about because, in case you didn't know, it's blood ties, the theme for Ake. What part of your roots was a part of your roots, part of this emotion you're talking about?
It is. It's something that's been with me for, I feel, since I was a child. Certainly, I went to boarding school in the UK when I was like 12 years old, and I went there excited to tell them about the incredible city I'm from, Lagos. And so many other people just couldn't picture Lagos. They couldn't picture a vibrant city. All they could imagine was what they'd been raised to imagine, which is just arid red soil, where nothing but misery grows. And what was even more annoying about it was that I wasn't sent to London. I was sent to a small British city called Bath. The population is like Mushi, you know? And so if Nigerians landed there today, we could run the place within a month.
Take note.
So if anybody should have looked down on anybody, I should have looked down on them, you know? And so that was kind of, but then it sticks with you because all you want to explain is the vibrancy of your hometown, of the people, the diversity. But there was a fundamental curiosity that just wasn't there for people. And it's just what they've seen on their TVs, what they've grown with. And then you kind of have to then work out why they feel that way, why they blame, you know, quote unquote Africans for where they are today. And then when you unpack that, when you understand that what we inherited was this what was meant to be very violent states, regions that were just impossible to work out, you know, and what we have managed to do with them, even though there's so much more work to be done, is something that when you understand it deeply, you start to feel even more pride for the past 60 years and for where we are, hopefully still to go.
Yeah, we managed to stay together so far. So, Kojo, what do you have for us? What were you warned about? Where is it?
So I think I'll read from a section which I was warned about in terms of pointing towards the corporate and commercial element behind empire, which I think also resonates with a lot of what Dipo has been saying. So I'll read the section first and then maybe speak a little bit further. So, in June 2020, the national myth of liberal, tolerant Britain and the legacy of these colonial companies left behind collided and resulted in an eruption of tension where a statue of Edward Colston in the center of Bristol was torn down by Black Lives Matter protests before being thrown into the Bristol harbour. Colston had been a prominent member of the Royal Africa Company, which was incorporated in 1660 and enjoyed a monopoly over the English trade in slaves from the West African coast to the Americas. It is estimated that during Colston's time at the RAC, 84,000 men, women, and children were taken by the company's ships from their homes in West Africa to suffer a life of slavery in the New World, with a quarter of them not even surviving the journey, so horrific were the conditions upon the ship. The image of Colston's statue being thrown into the river by a multiracial group of young protesters had become the symbol of a new generation's demand for Britain to fully reckon with its oppressed colonial past. The outpouring of rage witnessed in the Black Lives Matter protests provoked local authorities and public institutions across the country to reconsider the names that make up the public spaces of Britain's cities. But this event provoked a backlash from critics who accused the protesters of erasing history. They pointed to Colston's reputation as a great philanthropist, someone who, in donating to schools and churches and charities across the city of Bristol, did a lot to help the poor of Britain, even if he enriched himself through the dehumanization of Africans. This argument, often provided whenever a challenge to the legacy of these old colonial companies is offered, not only draws a false equivalence between the value of buildings and the value of massacred men, women, and children, but also misunderstands the role of the commercial corporation in the age of empires. Before the passing of the Registration Act of 1844 and the Joint Stock Company Act of 1856, colonial companies needed to be granted a royal charter to exist, and in order to get that charter, they would have to show that they carried out some sort of social purpose, however broadly defined, similar to the charitable idea of the corporation that existed in the medieval age. This is why the East India Company or the Virginia Company would speak so fondly of social benefit. The Hudson Bay Company would donate money to hospitals across London and took boys from orphanages. The philanthropy of these colonial companies and their directors wasn't simply an attempt to do social good to help balance out the bad things. It wasn't even a cynical public relations attempt at what today we might call corporate social responsibility. Instead, their charity was a necessary requirement for them to be able to sin in the first place. Something you had to commit if you wanted to receive the right to incorporate and profit from lucrative trading monopolies. Celebrating the philanthropy of old colonial companies and their directors is the equivalent of celebrating a plane hijacker for having bought a flight ticket beforehand.
What were you warned about? And who warned you? Clearly you didn't listen.
I didn't listen. Although I thought that the mic cutting out was maybe somebody shutting me down once and for all.
Oh, no, we don't do that here.
No. You know, with hacking, people can do anything these days. But I think people are much more comfortable talking about the idea of the legacy of empire as a cultural phenomenon rather than an economic or financial phenomenon. Because once you start to touch people's money, that's where people become uncomfortable. And the idea of the commercial driver behind empire, I don't think could be more clearly expressed than when we think about this very country that we're talking in. You know, as Dipo mentioned when he talked about, you know, Nigeria is a country that was designed by the British Empire to fail, I would agree with that 90%, except I would say that it wasn't designed as a country. It was designed as a commercial entity. There's that wonderful line in Burna Boy's album where he says, Nigeria began as a business deal between a company and an empire, that it was designed and coordinated by the Royal Niger Company in order to maximize profits for British commercial entities. And this is the way that we see so many of these other colonial companies, whether it's the East India Company on the Indian subcontinent, whether it's the Hudson Bay Company in the Caribbean and North America, whether it's, you know, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now BP. All of these companies not only designed empire for material enrichment, which still counts to this day, but also a lot of them didn't go anywhere. We all know the Royal Niger Company changed its name. We all know the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company changed its name. And I think this legacy of empire is the one that people were avoiding talking about and instead trying to encourage the British public to have endless debates about whether people should or shouldn't read Jane Austen.
Thank you. Away from the, so colonialism is multifaceted. It's not just the cultural looting. There's the economic, which formidable people, pen prize winners are warned not to talk about. Imagine little old us, what would happen if we started talking about the economic legacies. But I raise all this to say there's such a recency, that's the word you used, to colonialism that is quite shocking if you really look at it. So for example, English remains the mainstay. Meanwhile, the north of Nigeria was the last to allow women to vote. And historians write that part of that is because the British was not so in tune with the North. The North was quite resistant in terms of language. And what that meant was that the South and the East got voting rights for women earlier. In some cases, about 20 years earlier. Fast forward to now, 25 years earlier than women in the North. Fast forward to now, and I work in the grant sector, and English remains dominant. Some languages are prioritized in much the same way that some languages were prioritized and raised to the point of national official languages over others. And so I raise this to say, you both talk about coups, the corporate coups that were implemented to seize national assets and turn them private. You also talk about the coups. In fact, he has a whole chapter on 7 dictators. Some of this is relevant because you talk about Bouteflika, and we are seeing sort of the same thing playing out in Ondo State. You can fill in the gaps yourself. And so I wanted to ask you, when you talk about either economic coups or actual coups, what other resonances are you seeing from empire right now that we should be really careful of?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And the issue of coups is incredibly important because democracy across the continent is something that has been used to attack Africans as being uncivilized and behind the rest of the world on, without realizing that a lot of the dynamics that created these strongmen in the first place came from the Western world. It came from, the Cold War, where the then Soviet Union and the US would sort of pick and choose their favorite dictators and pay them. There's one example in the book of General Siad Barre then literally going to the White House and handing over a list of demands for his support, which were then given to him. And so we see these things happen without the understanding behind it. There's so much lack of understanding at the heart of, what happened in Rhodesia and what eventually would birth Zimbabwe, and the depth of the white supremacy there that inspired white supremacists in America, who are looking at America saying, America's not racist enough, you should see what's going on with the British colonialists, what they're doing in what is now Zimbabwe. And a nation like Zimbabwe having to come out of that, and so we see that resonance, and then we see the impact that it has on so many other issues in the way we think, in our education system, in the democracies that many of us, many African countries still use, that are not necessarily best suited for our cultures and our ideas, and the way in which we are divided, and having to reckon with all those things. But most importantly, we see it in just how young these countries are, and how little time we've had to try and both stabilize ourselves as well as look towards the future. And so there is this idea that we still haven't really started. Most of what we've had to go through over the last 60 years has been just to stabilize ourselves. But there's still so much more that needs to be done just for us to have gotten to the point where we've unraveled so much of what was deliberately stitched into us in order for us to then either collapse quickly after independence, or for us to try and redraw the entire map. But the moment we decided to stick with what we had, it had taken since 1884 right up until 1960 for a lot of this to be stitched into us. We've had considerably less time to try and unstitch it and then develop our own identities, our own culture, as a united country, a country that we didn't ask for in the first place. And that is the fundamental challenge that we continue to face right up until now.
Very succinct, because you also, what I like about these books is they both do not just go on about what has gone wrong, what we need to remember. They also talk about the way forward and what we can do, regardless of skin color or location. There's a whole chapter on what unites us, what is common to us in Africa, and we'll talk about that in a bit. I want to be mindful of time. So really quickly, you talk about the state a lot, and the fact that one of the hallmarks of colonialism which exists now is that states were required to have certain infrastructure that was basically a rip-off of the system in Britain. You should have a parliament. Whether or not you all speak the same language doesn't matter. You should have an upper and a lower house. Your lawyers should wear wigs, even in the stifling African heat and the Hamatan breeze. But what I want to ask is, this, and doing all that, it did not matter. It didn't mean our sovereignty was going to be assured, because as you point out directly, every country's sovereignty is only dependent on the rest of the imperial powers, the powerful powers, recognizing that sovereignty and respecting it and not invading at will. These two structures of sovereignty and state infrastructure, what do they look like now?
I think when we consider sovereignty on the African continent, we have to go back to that moment of decolonization and recognize a kind of bait and switch that was facilitated by the imperial powers at that time, in which the powers of state infrastructure, the powers that are supposed to extend across not just domestic authority, but foreign policy, economic autonomy. Some of those were handed back through decolonization, but others were taken off the table. And so whilst there was this transfer of sovereignty where now, Africans got to have their own flags and their own presidents and get to sing our own national anthems, but at the same time you saw the rise of the kind of international economic institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, later the World Trade Organization, which would take huge swathes of economic opportunities off the table. So, regardless of who you voted in as your new president, there were certain things they couldn't do without getting the backlash of the global economy. And so when we talk about the kind of strongmans and the coup d'etats that Dipo wonderfully illustrates in his book, that needs to be connected to the limited powers that African leaders had. You couldn't nationalize your national resources. You couldn't place protectionist laws in against foreign investment. You could do that, but you would face the backlash, an extreme backlash. And so what are you left to do? You're left with the powers of disciplining your population, increasing police powers, taxing them, passing in more stringent laws, because those powers of sovereignty are relatively limited. And I think that has a lot to do with simply inheriting the structures of imperial rule. And this is something that, in terms of you mentioned just briefly the wigs that lawyers have to wear, even in the Baking
I have a
West
personal
African
problem
heat.
with those.
Well, one thing that I think that maybe people, in Nigeria and in Ghana and elsewhere don't know is that there's actually black lawyers in the UK trying to stop them having to wear the wigs because they're like, I can't balance this on my afro. And the response that the legal profession in the UK has given them is going, well, actually, this can't be colonial because in Nigeria and in Ghana, they're still choosing to wear them. And so they're making them keep wear them to this day. And so this is the way in which this bait and switch, I think, continues to operate, and we need to be aware of it if we want to be able to imagine a different type of future.
So just to quickly stay with you, Kojo, just to quickly stay with you. So let's talk about the future. You say there's an alternative way. In fact, in Kojo's book, he describes what he calls the boomerang of colonialism, where it was thrown out and then it reverberates back. It comes back to us on our wigs and our afros. So what's the alternative way? What do all of us in this room need to do to contribute in our own way? We have policymakers, there's people all over the world, we have our audiences, our creatives. What's the alternative way that you speak about?
What I try and do in On Commonwealth is to go back to that moment of decolonization and look at different visions of the future that were being articulated in that moment, particularly what was referred to as kind of third worldism at the time. Like by the time I was growing up in the UK, like Dipo was saying, the idea of being third world was an insult, straight and simple. It was the idea of being poor, being hungry, being incompetent. That's what the third world meant. But when you go back to the writings of everyone from Emile Cabral to Kwame Nkrumah to Michael Manley to even the Black Panther Party in the United States of America, they were all tied into this idea of what they called a third worldist vision, a kind of alternative way outside of the state communism of the Soviet Union and the kind of free market capitalism of the West. And I think that when we look at, say, even documents like one of the great products of the Third Worldist movement was a document that was passed through the United Nations called the New International Economic Order. This was passed in the late 70s, driven by Manley in Jamaica. And when you read that document today in 2023, it still sounds like it's talking about the future. It talks about things like a guaranteed right to food for every person in the world, kind of insulated within the United Nations and enforced by the United Nations. It talks about the right of every country to be able to have permanent sovereignty over its own national resources. It talks about environmental sustainability. And I think returning back to that moment can give us some tools that we can use to try and face some of these issues on a global scale.
Thank you. And your vision of the future is remarkable because you say the young people are going to do it. while you don't say the rest of us have fucked up, you do say that, which some of us have, let's be honest. You do say that we should look at the young people. And then when we look in light of the sort of context, de-propagandization that young people do on TikTok and they do everywhere, can you give us a glimpse of what that future is in your book without giving too much away, because we're going to sell these books whether you like it or not?
I mean, I end the book talking about the future, and I've never been one to, so many global organizations simply just say, the future is Africa without explaining what that means. They'll say, oh, they're young, so therefore things can get better, they can get worse. And the idea isn't to make people come away feeling pessimistic. I hope people read this book and come away feeling optimistic about the future. The benefit of understanding our past and the benefit of having these very young countries is that there is a wonderful opportunities to still shape these nations. You have the independence leaders and you have their generation. We are still the founding fathers of these countries. We're still, the principals who are going to have the biggest impact in what these countries are going to be into the future. As I said earlier, we haven't even started. Nigeria is a country that's run on confidence and vibes and very little else. We're just with energy starting every day, leaving your house and just trying to do what you can do. Who we really are going to be is still to be written. And it's something that I want to empower people to feel that they have the tools to do that. And it's not going to be easy. It's not a straight path. It's on us to fix. It's on us to do. We need to take that responsibility, but it's something that, we should feel like we have a really great opportunity to do. And we have time, but also we need to get going as well. So I hope people kind of read the book and feel that the future can only be bright and we can only move in the right direction if there are enough people committed to that movement. And it's not always going to go in, the straightforward, positive way, but with enough people who are committed. One of the other things that I find so incredible about the journey we've all been on in the last 60 years is really how patriotic we've become to these countries. That was something that is really fundamental to building a nation, is that we do feel proud to say that we're Nigerian, we're Ghanaian, we're South African, we're Kenyan. We've been able to take this thing and build a culture around it. And that is the work of the average person. Sometimes you'll hear politicians say, the unity of Nigeria cannot be questioned. No government can force people to feel patriotic. That is something that the people have to work, and we've done that through food and culture and arts. We've exported that. What Afrobeats is doing now is incredible.
Yeah.
And there are young British white boys singing in Yoruba every weekend across, and they don't care what they're saying. It doesn't matter.
Properly.
To be in that scene is to be cool. And that is something that, I could never have imagined when I went to boarding school. These things change so quickly and so rapidly if, those of us commit to whatever area you're in, whether it's in books, education, art, fashion, film, whatever it is, there is that opportunity. And, it's something that people should feel optimistic about. And hopefully they've been armed with that information, understanding where we've come from, the mistakes that have been made, the positive contributions that have been made, and then take that with you and then build the nation that you want.
Build the nation that you want, because you are going to live in it. I need to ask this question really quickly before we go to Q&A, because we need to start Q&A. And please, quick answers. You have a section on what unites us. It's jollof rice. Yeah, he has a whole section on jollof rice. He has a whole section on AFCON, the African Nations, or the African Cup of Nations. And so I wanted to ask you, you talk about people doing their bit, and right here are people who want to write. You guys both took on the most stringent form of non-fiction. That's the one that has to do with history and current affairs. And you took on the big C, colonialism. What quick tip would you give to somebody who wants to write in that genre? What's your tip for them?
the mistake a lot of people make is that they think that nonfiction should just be about dates and places and times. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. And so they take away the humanity of every story. They take away the people, the individuals, the emotions that they felt. That is really what matters. And one little technique I try to do is I try to never start a paragraph with a date. To say in 1974,
that's your tip, right?
This happened and this happened. You know, there were people involved in it. You know, and that was probably the thing from the research I enjoyed the most, was finding out about the people involved, you know, and finding out what their motivations were, writing about these, you know, these men and women who had this incredible responsibility, finding out that, you know, many of them were my age now. What is it that they wanted? What were their motivations? What stood in their way? So always ensure that you make it about people and about emotions and about community, and not just about place and time and dates.
And not to have a spoiler, but watch out for the very, very funny description of Kagame of Rwanda. I think that's one of the examples of what you are saying, humanizing even interesting people. What's your tip for us?
Very brief and very similar to Dipo's. I think remembering the drama that exists within nonfiction, the idea that the greatest dramas, the greatest jealousies, the greatest fears, the greatest anxieties that we experience through fiction, we also see in real life, and especially in a historical period as dramatic as the period of decolonization. I feel that as decolonization became about everything over the last few years. It became about decolonizing museums, decolonizing curriculums, decolonizing TV shows. But we forget that there was a moment in the 20th century, which is probably the most dramatic moment of that dramatic century, where almost 2/3 of the world shift from being colonial subjects into being sovereign, independent nation states. And the drama and stories of that era have not yet been told. The figures who went from being political prisoners and suddenly you're now the president or the minister of finance and you've got your hands on the instruments of state power. There's drama, there's passion, and I think that should be remembered if you want to write nonfiction.
Just
go ahead.
And that was perfectly put, especially in terms of kind of the drama of reality. And if you're a nonfiction writer and you ever are stuck with how to do it, make sure you read fiction. You know, read lots and lots of fiction, and that will kind of get you out of that habit of treating nonfiction as if it isn't about stories. Most of the reading that I do is fiction, and it has made such a big difference in my writing.
Thank you. And now we will have questions. I believe someone already has the mic. Oh,
yeah. Apparently, I have to stand up. So I have a question for each of the two panelists. Dipo, is there a place for Pan-Africanism in a time when we're talking about nation states in Africa, when we really had nothing to do with the borders? And Kojo, I wanted to ask, your book is historical. What is it that on a continent where the average age is 19.6 years old, and they have shaken the tables with NSAS protests and fees must fall and whatever, what can they learn from you? Can they learn anything from you?
There's definitely a role that Pan-Africanism can play, and that's why I end the book talking about Pan-Africanism. You know, obviously this idea was sort of introduced by people like Kwame Nkrumah straight after independence, and you know, of course, there are so many independence leaders who were not interested in this idea because they had just successfully fought for their countries. They're on the cusp of getting to lead these countries. They had no interest in giving up that power, and I think that was actually turned out to be an important decision in terms of everyone just kind of looking inward, trying to get your own house in order, sorting out these ethnic divisions and ethnic tensions, and then coming out of that with whatever it is you've managed to make. And now I think there's such a wonderful opportunity for us to learn from each other, to learn from this shared, shared almost like a trauma from the colonialism, to ask each other, how did you do it? How did I do? Okay. You know, and that's one of the incredible things that we saw during the recent, youth-led movements, where lots of cross-country collaborations, lots of learnings, especially when it came to things like, ensuring that you didn't have one central leader, that, you all did your role and did your part. And so all these things, there's such a wonderful opportunity for us to look outward and say, here is the nation that we have built. Now let's see how we can all work together and learn from each other's mistakes and, build the futures that we want to do in a way that, continues to grow and grow and grow. And I think that, that is something that is really essential to our collective futures.
Brilliant. And regarding the youth and the energy of youth on the African continent now, first of all, I feel like you're not saying I'm not young. I felt like I was young, but now your question clearly shows you're like, can they learn anything from you, uncle? I said, okay, so I'm at uncle status now. Okay, I accept it.
Uncle, can they learn anything from you?
Absolutely. I was like, no, I know. But I think that absolutely every time I come back, you see not just the youth and the energy, but also the kind of technological insight that young people have, the way in which, whether we're thinking about fintech, whether we're thinking about social media, that in many ways the African continent is now at the forefront of this kind of trajectory of development. In many ways, when we're thinking about, techniques of, financial technology and how that can allow for certain amounts of collaboration and growth in microeconomies, it's Africa which is placed in the examples that places in Europe and North America are now trying to implement. But I think that that is only going to have real teeth and real volatility if we can create collaboration between the diaspora communities and the communities on the continent as well. My example that I would draw upon, I think you kind of alluded to it when you mentioned Fees Must Fall, but you think about the Roads Must Fall campaign that came first. That was something that emerged, or erupted, I would rather say, in South Africa with the pulling down of the Roads Must Fall statue, but then went back to Oxford,
Bristol.
Where Rhodes actually was from, where the money was coming from, where those Rhodes scholarships were being come from. So the British protesters were inspired by the South African protesters, and then the British protest success also created conditions for further success in South Africa. And I think that that kind of dialectic is something that has real potential, especially when you think about the youth, energy, and intelligence of young people in Africa at the moment.
I think there's people at the back. Oh, I think Kina's hand was up first, and then there's... Briefly, please, we're already...
Thank you, because I love Zuki, but the question of what youth... So inherent in this idea that maybe of course the young people are going to do it because our lives are forfeiting the struggle. They are going to have to do it because that's what's going to happen on the continent. But when we continue, it's an avoidance when we say, can youth learn from us? Because we don't want to face up to what is going on. And of course, it's only going to happen when we actually accept that young people are going to learn from us. And we learn from them, but absolutely they are going to have to learn from us because we are going to have to learn from the generation before us. And that's why I love your two books. This is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. They are not going to rescue us. And we're not going to avoid the confrontation and the help and everything, the foundations that we have to build. That's why Lola is here. Thank you very much, Lola. But I would need us to understand that in that question is we can't avoid, as 50-year-olds, the work that has to be done, that we have to do. Because if we continue to say, of course, Africa is a young continent. I love the optimism of your books. But optimism is a lot of work. There's a lot of work to achieve the vision. And we are absolutely going to have to do it. So that's just my...
And someone says all of us, and I totally agree. There is a place for the walking museums that are the older generation. I remember you telling me you had to speak to your parents because one parent is Yoruba, the other is Igbo, and you relied on them to get that sort of balance that was needed for the sensitivity. So I do think there's a place for all the museums that walk around, the museums that are our parents, to be able to, it's a little bit like what our ancestors were. They were the storytellers. They were the bards that told the oral history, without which we wouldn't have the books. and the books without which we wouldn't have the non-fiction books, and the non-fiction books without which the youth, maybe 100 years from now, they'll be talking about some guy with a bald head and another guy with nice shoes. I'm biased, I'm Nigerian, what were you expecting? Yeah, I think there's a question here and here. Oh, a lot of questions. Oh dear, you all are in trouble. Joking. Yeah, when you get the mic, just be brief. Oh wow, there are a lot of hands. That's a good sign. I hope these hands result in book sales because our authors will be outside waiting for you. Writers must eat. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panels. My question is to Dipo particularly, and I think the last speaker mentioned, the books come across as very realistic. There is hope and the likes, and that we still have some time. But then you had mentioned something about the big men, being in charge, and like, okay, there's a competition or something. So using Nigeria as like a case study, looking at elections,
Question, please.
Oh,
What's the question?
Okay.
Sorry
about the preamble. Okay, so do we, as the youth, as the young people, what are we waiting for? Because these big men are begetting and raising up other people to be big men, and then there is no collective will where we are able to push back and say, this is our country. Oh, it's still not a question.
No, it's not.
What can we do?
I think the question is just what can we do
to stop
all this thing happening?
Thank you.
And I think what I end in the book is trying to explain what people are already doing when it's, whether it's in NSARS or other youth-led.
We have 10 extra minutes.
Fantastic. So what I want to do towards what's happening?
Oh my gosh, this is a good sign. People are upset about the mic. Oh, I'm flattered on your behalf. Go on, please.
We have time. We have time now. One second. Let me just answer this question.
We have time, my people.
But
we
yes,
have time.
we'll just answer this question, then you can
Let's
go.
answer and then do.
But yeah, no, it's what I try to do with the book is not just say, oh, everything's going to be fantastic. What the best predictor of the future is what people are doing now. And so it's trying to lay out here exactly some of the recent youth-led movements across the continent, whether it's in Algeria, NSARS here in Nigeria, what we see in all sorts of different countries from youth-led movements, hopefully to give, a sort of a manuscript for others who want to follow through. And so when I was writing the book, I obviously had me and my generation to think about. I had my nephew and my niece's generation to think about, hoping that they then also can see what has been done before them as an actual kind of specific guideline to here's what happened, here's how they organized for this protest, and hopefully that will then lead to further action as well.
Yes. Someone has a...
Oh, yeah.
Tolu, hi.
Yeah. First, let me thank all the people who joined me to raise hands so that the mic will get here. For Dipo, this is for Dipo. So I want to hear what Dipo has to say about this idea. You talked a lot about, we were handed a country that was not designed to work. That yoking together and all that. But it's not an African thing only. Italy, for example, so famously when Obafemi Awolowo said Nigeria is a mere geographical expression.
Question, please, my love.
He was talking about Italy. So at what point do we move from that obsession with what was handed to us and move to the idea of thinking about the agency that we have, like other places, like the Italys and the Belgiums and the United Kingdoms, to chart and define our own destiny?
Exactly. So that's a very important question. And one thing that the book sort of focuses on is here is a guideline as to how we got to where we are today so we don't make the same mistakes into the future. Right now, the future of this country is in nobody is, as said earlier, nobody's going to come to save us. It's our responsibility. If there are any problems, as we saw with NSARS, for example, they looked towards their own government. They didn't send representatives to the White House to say, come and help us. We demanded change from our own representatives. And so what understanding our history does, and you mentioned sort of Italy and some other examples, what is particularly unique about our reality is the way in which, we didn't touch on it earlier, but our borders, for example. If you ever look at a map of Africa, you should just be angry because there's just straight lines that carved up ethnic groups from each other, split up about 30% of all ethnic groups, had no interest in what actually existed on the ground at the time. And so there are all those things you have to firstly understand in order to build that future that you want. And so it is on us to do it. It's our responsibility. But it's important to understand how we got here in the first place. And that is what we will then use to build the tools that we ourselves, nobody else, that we ourselves need to use to develop into the future. And that is the thing that is really key. It's not to sit and blame anybody and say, they did this to us, let's all sit down and not do anything about it. Which is why I said that I hope people finish the book feeling optimistic, feeling like they are empowered to go out there and do the work that is needed to be done with that knowledge of, okay, here's how we got here, here's how we were created, here's how we were built, here are the dynamics, the mistakes that we even made post-independence. Let us also, of course, learn from other countries as well, how they dealt with certain issues, and then let's take those tools and do what is needed to do right by our fellow citizens.
Kojo, how do we move? I'm very interested in your take. How do we move from recounting the horrors of colonialism to reframing our future and our agency?
Wonderful. I mean, just before I answer that, I would also just take a second just to also trouble the idea that places like Italy and the UK, you know, that they are settled and they are organized and they are fine, and we only have chaos over here in Ghana and Nigeria. When I read a newspaper in the UK over the last few years, there's been a lot of chaos, there's been a lot of fragmentation. You know, places like Italy, you have desperate poverty when you go to places in the south, and so I think that there is always a danger as well of kind of idealizing what's going on in Europe, not recognizing that a lot of the same failures and fragmentations that have been eroding the democracy in the African continent since independence are now bleeding back into the mainland itself.
I don't think that's what the speaker was referring to. He was referring to at some point
you have to move
a
beyond
country decided to seize agency. So how do we get ourselves to also seize agency more in some form?
Well, I think one of the first things they did with the examples that he mentioned was recognize their position within a global entity. And so when you think about how places like Italy, Belgium, some of the smaller European countries and European nation states managed to give themselves some security in the post-war world, they teamed up together and created a European Union. They created a single currency that allowed their currency to have strength and not have the kind of volatile inflations. You know, the currencies of these countries used to be in your 2000s lira, in your 4000s when you thought about the Spanish pesos and all those kind of currencies. But now with the euro, you have a lot more centrality and you have a lot more ability to control your own trade infrastructure and ensure that that balance of trade is much more equitable.
I mean,
so you need to recognize where you are.
The Francophone countries are trying to do that, though, with the currency, with the echo.
Yeah, and so I think that it's
fantastic.
fantastic. I think that it's great that there needs to be more collaboration, not just on the African continent, but for me, amongst countries that are in what now would be called the global south, what 30 years ago would have been called the third world. I think as money, forums, you know, because there used to be forums, there used to be the Tricontinental Conference, there used to be the Bandung Conference, there used to be places where people in the same position in a global order would get together and say, how can we coordinate and collaborate in order to improve our position collectively? That's the big thing that improved conditions in places like Italy, Belgium, and Spain, and I think that's something that we could learn from in this continent.
Okay, follow the money.
She's had her hand up.
We have a baby. Oh, and our kid baby's hand is up. Anyway, I'm here for the kids.
So thank you so much for the panel. My question is for Dr. Kojo. I'm interested in this dialectic between the symbolic and the economic that your work is suggesting, and to think about its history in colonial struggles, to think about the fact that independent struggles had, you know, the economic as central, and then with, you know, the culture movement, with Stuart Hall's work, culture started to become the thing in itself. But at what point do you think that the symbolic let go of the material concerns? And do you have a theory for why the symbolic endures as the thing in itself of empire? And finally, is there a way to hold that dialectic in Stuart Hall's kind of vision of culture, symbolic, are sitting together with the economic. Thank you.
And if you could do that as well in simpler English, it would be great. Because I'm kind of lost.
First of all, that was a wonderful question, so
was?
thank you. And I think, to, I guess, put it in as simple English
Because we
as
have a
possible.
range of
course.
ages, audience ages.
I think what the question was asking was about the way in which the kind of symbolic representations of empire, so the language you speak, the films you watch, the way you dress, the music that you listen to, have now become the way we focus on the legacy of empire, and we've ignored, what were the economic structures, what were the companies doing, where was the money going. And I think that there is, of course, a significant importance in focusing upon the cultural and symbolic part. We should not just read English writers, we should also read African writers. That is important. But as I say in the book, that was not the driving motivation behind empire. Nobody got on a ship in the 17th century and sailed halfway across the Atlantic to give somebody a copy of Charles Dickens. That was not what was important. It was about the extraction and transfer of resources. And I feel that in the initial decolonial moment, there was a recognition of that. But then with the failure to be able to challenge the economic power of the West, I think this is something that people who might associate themselves with decolonial traditions have to look inward and say that we I feel almost gave up on that struggle and went, okay, well, we're not going to get, BP to change their, trade relationship with Nigeria, but we can maybe, focus on what exhibitions are in the British Museum, or we can maybe focus on what books are on the curriculum at different universities. And so we focused on the symbolic, which I think is important, and Stuart Hall was fantastic in illustrating how the symbolic kind of justifies the economic, because it says these people don't have culture, these people don't have language, therefore you can't trust them to manage their own resources, you can't allow them to have property claims over their own land. It's better that we take care of it. So there is a relationship between the symbolic and the cultural, but I think in recent years we focus just on the cultural, and what I try and do in this book is bringing it back to the economic, because I think that that's at the heart of it.
It's always about the money. I think we have time for one more question before I then ask you folks what you're up to next. Someone's hand here is also up.
Hello?
Okay, ask your question and we must come to you, our youngest guest.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask a question, a follow-up question on that, on the economic angle.
Okay.
When we got independence, we supposedly got political independence and not economical independence. And looking at it now, we are in billions of dollars in debt to big for international corporations and organizations. And
Question, please.
This
Question,
no doubt
please.
will influence our policies. And what is the way to go, learning from the problems of economic independence in the 1960s from these countries, and what is the way forward with relation to this now?
Thank you.
Should I answer that?
Take a stab. You are the Penn Prize winner.
Am I? The problem in economic terms isn't the debt. The UK is in trillions of dollars of debt. The US is in trillions of dollars of debt. The problem is whose debts are being enforced and who's being made to restructure their economy in order to pay off debts that are never going to be paid off. Those structural adjustment programs are not to clear off the debts of these countries. They're never getting paid off because that's not how the economy works. The economy doesn't work like our own, households where if you're in debt then you're sweating and you're arguing, with your, why, how can we pay this bill? That's not how economies work. Debt's used as a vehicle and as an engine to drive growth. And in other places, they're allowed to run up huge deficits and huge debts annually in order to drive growth, but they're not going to be insisted to restructure their economy by the IMF and the World Bank or the WTO. They're not going to have investor state dispute resolution tribunals being made to give up part of their economy to private interests, but that does happen in other countries. And it's that inequality that I think we need to correct, not just focus on the kind of self-blame of, oh, we've got into debt, it must be corruption, because there's trillions of dollars in debt in the US economy as well.
Okay. And our final We saw some hands up. Our youngest guests.
Who encouraged you to write a book?
I mean, this is the best question. The rest of you, absolute bunkum.
My wonderful family, including my niece, Olivia, and my niece, Chikemi, and my nephew, Fermi, whoever he is, and all our wonderful family and friends, some of whom are here with us today. So it was something that from the beginning, before I even had an idea for the book, they were asking, you know, when are you going to write a book? When are you going to write a book? And, you know, before I could see it, they could see it. And that is the great value of family. So, yes.
We've got 48 seconds more. What are you working on in one sentence?
It's complicated. It's very complicated. But
I didn't ask you for
some
your
ideas,
Facebook status.
Some ideas. I have some ideas, but it'll be within the space of Africa and the diaspora, I think.
Okay. Still non-fiction?
For now, yes.
Cool. What are you working on, Doctor?
It's still non-fiction, but more narrative, trying to tell more stories. And then I also got encouraged by my daughter and niece and nephew as well. But they weren't as encouraging as yours, because then when I wrote the book, my daughter said, there's no pictures, this is very boring. So
always listen to your daughters.
So next time I think I'll write something with some pictures.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful, Ake. Thank you. Thank you, Dipo. Thank you, Lola. Thank you, Dr. Kojo. Pen Prize winner.